He is the highest-grossing actor in Hollywood history. Over $27 billion at the box office. A voice recognized on every continent. And yet, he was 43 years old before Hollywood truly saw him. Behind the authority, behind the icon, there was a man who spent 20 years being overlooked, a decade being consumed from the inside, and one specific night when everything, the career, the marriage, the future, nearly ended on a kitchen floor. How does a boy silenced by a stammer become the most commanding voice in cinema? What kept him standing through 20 years of closed doors? And what does it actually cost to build a legacy the industry refused to hand you? But to understand what he built, we need to understand first what he survived. And that story begins long before Hollywood ever entered the picture. Samuel Leroy Jackson was born on December 21, 1948, in Washington, D.C. But Washington was never really his home. His mother, Elizabeth, moved them almost immediately to Chattanooga, Tennessee, a city where the rules of American life were written in two colors, and neither of them was kind to a black child with no father, no fortune, and nothing but intelligence and hunger to separate him from the weight pressing down on every corner of his world. His father, Roy Henry Jackson, left before Samuel could form a single memory of him. There was no dramatic farewell, no explained absence, no letter that arrived years later with a reason stitched inside. There was simply nothing. A silence where a man should have been. Roy would resurface decades later, a ghost, returning with the hollow timing of someone who had missed everything that mattered, appearing only when Samuel was already grown, already scarred, already shaped entirely by the absence itself. They would meet briefly, coldly, with the strained formality of two strangers sharing a last name. The door closed again not long after. Roy died of an illness before any real reckoning could take place, taking with him every answer Samuel had spent a lifetime carefully not asking aloud. That silence became the first lesson Samuel ever learned, that you could need someone completely, and they could simply choose not to be there. Raised by his mother and grandparents in a working-class neighborhood in Chattanooga, Samuel grew up in a world defined by segregation. Not the polite textbook version of the word, the lived version. Separate water fountains, separate schools, separate entrances. The daily, grinding, humiliating reminder that the country he was born into had decided, before he drew his first breath, that his life was worth measurably less than the lives of his white neighbors across town. His grandfather, a quiet but deeply commanding man, became the closest thing to a father figure Samuel would ever know in those years. Steady, principled, and fiercely proud, he gave the boy a foundation when the world outside was offering mostly walls and locked doors. School was complicated. Samuel was sharp, undeniably, and almost inconveniently so, but restless in the way that highly intelligent children become when the classroom cannot keep pace with their hunger. He stuttered badly as a young child, a stammer that wrapped itself around his words and held them hostage before they could reach the air. In a world that already offered him a profoundly limited voice, the cruelty of that stammer was almost poetic in its timing. The boy who had the most to say was the one the language kept trying to silence. He fought it, quietly, persistently, and almost entirely alone. By the time he reached Morehouse College in Atlanta, something had already shifted. The stammer had not disappeared, but he had learned to move around it, through it, almost weaponizing the deliberate pause it forced upon him. Morehouse, the historically black institution that had already shaped men like Martin Luther King Jr. and would continue shaping generations of leaders and thinkers. U became the first place Samuel truly felt the full electricity of his own potential. The campus crackled with intellectual energy, political urgency, and the specific kind of pride that flourishes when brilliant people are finally surrounded by others who reflect their worth back to them. It was there, on a Morehouse stage, in the college theater program, that he discovered what his voice could do when finally freed from silence. And it was there that history reached down and touched his life in a way he would carry in his chest forever. In 1968, Samuel L. Jackson traveled to Memphis, Tennessee, as part of a student delegation to attend the funeral of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., a man he had met briefly on the Morehouse campus in quieter days before the assassination. But Memphis was different. But Memphis was grief made visible and rage barely contained. A city holding its breath over an open wound. A nation cracking along every seam it had pretended were already healed. Standing in that crowd, a 19-year-old Samuel looked at the raw, trembling faces of a people who had just lost their most visible and beloved voice, and felt something harden inside him. Not into anger alone, though anger was certainly present, and entirely justified. Into purpose. Into the bone-deep, unshakable understanding that the world was not going to hand him anything. That survival was active, not passive. That you had to fight continuously and without apology, simply for the right to be seen and heard. But the fire of purpose, if it burns too hot without direction, can consume the very person it was meant to fuel. Back at Morehouse, Samuel's politics sharpened into direct action. Along with fellow students, he participated in holding members of the college board in a building, demanding curriculum reform and greater relevance in their education. The act was bold, idealistic, and carried real consequences. He was suspended, his future suddenly precarious, the walls closing in from every direction at once. His mother, furious and frightened in equal measure, pulled him back. She sent him away from Atlanta, away from the movement's heat and urgency, and toward New York City. The instruction was simple and firm. Go. Start over. Find another way. Samuel arrived in New York in the early 1970s with a theater degree, a stammer he had learned to transform into a weapon, a childhood of silence carved permanently into his chest, and the memory of standing in Memphis while the world grieved a man who had dared, above all else, to speak. He had survived a childhood designed to make him invisible. Now came the years that would test whether survival alone was enough. New York City, in the early 1970s, did not welcome dreamers. It devoured them. The city was broke, burning in certain neighborhoods, and drowning in a particular kind of cruelty reserved for those who arrived carrying talent without connections, ambition without money, and a skin color that still closed more doors than it opened, regardless of what was behind the eyes looking back from the other side. Samuel L. Jackson arrived into all of it simultaneously. A young black man from Chattanooga with a theater degree, an unquenchable need to perform, and absolutely nothing else to protect him from what the city had waiting. He threw himself into the theater world with the urgency of someone who had already spent too long being invisible. He landed with the Negro Ensemble Company, one of the most respected black theater institutions in America, a place where the craft was taken seriously, and the standards were unforgiving. The stage gave him oxygen. It gave him the discipline to take the raw, unpolished force living inside him and shape it into something controlled, deliberate, and genuinely devastating when deployed correctly. Directors noticed, fellow actors noticed, audiences noticed, But Hollywood did not call. The stage paid almost nothing. Auditions led to silence. Callbacks that felt genuinely promising dissolved back into that old, familiar nothing. The same silence he had grown up inside. The silence of being present and talented, and still somehow overlooked by the people with the power to change things. He took every job available. Roles so small they did not earn a screen credit. Background work. To community theater across the boroughs. Anything that kept him connected to performance, even at its most invisible margins. The bills did not care about his talent. He worked as a social worker for a period, trying to hold himself financially above water while refusing, with a stubbornness that was equal parts admirable and painful, to abandon the dream entirely. He stocked shelves. He took whatever came and whatever paid. And through all of it, through every indignity and every closed door, he kept showing up to auditions for an industry that kept finding sophisticated ways to look directly past him. In 1980, a small but meaningful door cracked open. He appeared briefly in early film work, and then in Ragtime, where he shared scenes with actors already ascending toward household names. He was good, unmistakably, undeniably good, in ways that people who saw him remembered afterward. But good, in an industry built on timing and relationships and the invisible mathematics of who gets to be considered, is rarely sufficient on its own. The years continued to stretch. The rejections continued to accumulate with the patient. Relentless consistency of something that has no reason to stop. And somewhere inside the widening gap between who he knew himself to be and what the world was willing to acknowledge, Samuel L. Jackson found a dangerous companion: drugs. It did not begin as destruction. It rarely does. It began as relief. As the sharp edge taken off a day that had offered nothing but closed doors, and the specific exhaustion of being talented enough to be occasionally noticed, but not yet powerful enough to be consistently chosen. A crack cocaine entered his life with the seductive, unhurried patience of something that already knows it has time on its side. And it stayed. For years, Samuel functioned within the addiction. He continued working, continued auditioning, continued carefully building a reputation in the New York theater community that was genuine and steadily growing, even as something else was quietly consuming him from the inside. In 1981, he married LaTanya Richardson, a fellow actor of extraordinary intelligence and strength, whose love for Samuel was real enough and deep enough to survive what was already coming, though it would be tested in ways that would have broken a different kind of person entirely. LaTanya saw the talent with absolute clarity. She also saw the addiction tightening its grip, slowly and methodically at first, and then with the speed and indifferent violence of something that had been patient long enough and was now collecting on what it was owed. Their daughter, Zoe, was born in 1982. Samuel held his child and felt what every parent feels in that first irreversible moment: the staggering, almost unbearable weight of responsibility, the terrifying, clarifying force of unconditional love. And for a time, fatherhood steadied him the way only the most profound things can, pushing the darkness back just far enough to see the next step, and the one after that. But addiction is not defeated by love alone. Love can slow it. Love can create reasons to fight. But love cannot reach inside a man and remove the thing that is killing him. That requires something harder and more personal than even the deepest devotion can provide. See, through the mid and late 1980s, Samuel continued building his career with the tenacity of someone who refused to accept the ceiling being constructed around him. Small film roles accumulated slowly, but meaningfully. A role in School Days for a young director named Spike Lee, planted the seed of a collaboration that would eventually grow into something transformative. He was building, brick by painful brick, a body of work that quietly insisted on being taken seriously. And yet, the addiction was building alongside it, matching him almost stride for stride. By the late 1980s, the crack cocaine use had escalated far beyond the point of management or concealment. The man who had survived Chattanooga's segregation and Memphis's grief and New York's merciless decade of professional rejection was now losing a quieter, more intimate, and in many ways more devastating battle. The one happening inside his own body, inside the apartment where his wife watched and worried and prayed, with the specific desperation of someone who can see exactly what is coming and cannot stop it alone. The breaking point arrived in 1991. LaTanya and Zoe came home to find Samuel unconscious on the kitchen floor, completely unreachable. The scene was not dramatic in any cinematic sense. There were no cameras, no swelling score to signal that this was the moment everything changed. There was only a woman standing in her kitchen, looking at the man she had chosen, making the most agonizing and most important calculation of her life. In a silence that contained everything, she called for help. And then she issued the ultimatum that would save his life, even as it nearly ended the marriage. Get clean or lose everything. All of it. Her, Zoe, the future, everything. Samuel entered rehabilitation. He was 42 years old. The process was not triumphant, or cinematic, or clean. It was brutal, humiliating, physically agonizing, and achingly slow. There were days he could not find a single reason that felt sufficient to continue. Days the craving was louder than every other voice in the room combined, louder than LaTanya's prayers, louder than Zoe's face in his memory, louder than the distant flickering dream of a career that had never fully caught fire. He stayed anyway, one day at a time, 1 hour at a time, sometimes 1 minute at a time, gripping the edges of sobriety with everything he had left, which at certain moments was almost nothing at all. He stayed. When Samuel L. Jackson walked out of rehabilitation in 1991, he walked into a world that had not saved him a seat. Hollywood does not pause for personal reckonings. It does not hold roles while men rebuild themselves from whatever they have managed to salvage. The industry had moved forward without him. New faces ascending, new names filling the spaces where he might have stood. And the clock that had already run considerably longer than most acting careers was still ticking with the indifferent patience of something that owes no one a second chance. He was 42 years old, sober, raw, and beginning again from a foundation that felt as fragile as it was hard-won. But sobriety had returned something to him that no audition, no callback, no professional success could have provided on its own. Clarity. For the first time in years, Samuel could see himself without the chemical fog that had softened every edge, including the ones he needed sharpest. He could feel the hunger again, clean and undiluted, and almost frightening in its focus. Not the desperate, scattered hunger of a man half-numbed by addiction, but the locked-in, ferocious hunger of a man who understood, with total and unforgiving lucidity, exactly how much time had been lost, and exactly how little he intended to lose from this moment forward. He went back to work immediately, and without hesitation. Spike Lee called, this time for Jungle Fever, in 1991. The role was Gator Purify, a man consumed and being destroyed by crack cocaine. The very substance Samuel had just spent months fighting free of in the most difficult battle of his life. And another director might have hesitated to offer it. Another actor might have refused it, unwilling to return so quickly to that particular darkness. Samuel accepted without a moment of visible uncertainty. He understood Gator from places no research and no preparation could have manufactured. The performance was devastating in its authenticity. Not a performance of addiction, but a portrait of it, drawn from the inside. Every tremor precisely calibrated. Every desperate moment ringing with the specific truth of someone who had actually lived inside that particular darkness and returned with their eyes open. Critics stopped in their tracks. The New York Film Critics Circle awarded him Best Supporting Actor. The industry, which had spent the better part of a decade and a half finding sophisticated ways to look past him, had suddenly looked directly at him and discovered it could not look away. The door did not open. It was torn from its hinges entirely. Offers began arriving. Real offers, for substantial roles in films that mattered, and directors who understood what they had. He appeared in Patriot Games, in Juice, in Amos and Andrew. Each role different, each one demonstrating a range that 20 years of stage work had quietly and patiently constructed while Hollywood was otherwise occupied. Directors began speaking about him in rooms he had not yet been invited to enter. A consensus was forming, tentative at first, and then unmistakable. This man is something extraordinary. And then came 1994. A young director named Quentin Tarantino was assembling a film that would detonate across the entire landscape of American cinema, with the force of something genuinely unprecedented. Pulp Fiction. The role of Jules Winfield, a philosophical hitman who quotes scripture before pulling the trigger with complete serenity, required an actor who could make the absurd feel inevitable, the violent feel almost poetic, and the mundane feel charged with something approaching cosmic weight. Tarantino wanted Samuel L. Jackson, with a certainty that did not leave room for negotiation. The studio pushed back. They offered other names, safer choices, actors whose faces already came attached to proven box office mathematics. The resistance was genuine, and the pressure was real. Tarantino held firm, with the particular, almost irrational stubbornness of a director who can see something in 3 dimensions that everyone else is only perceiving as flat. Samuel L. Jackson arrived on that set at 45 years old. He had spent over 2 decades on the absolute margins of an industry that kept finding reasons to overlook him. He had survived poverty and segregation, and 20 years of professional rejection, and a decade of addiction, and the specific, grinding humiliation of being talented enough to be occasionally noticed, but never quite powerful enough to be consistently chosen. He had rebuilt himself from the kitchen floor of his own apartment, using nothing but will and the love of a woman who had every reason to leave. And he walked onto that set and delivered one of the most iconic performances in the history of American cinema. The Ezekiel speech became legend, not merely for the words Tarantino had written, but for what Samuel brought to the silence surrounding them. The way he controlled the room with his physical stillness, the way his eyes moved between menace and something approaching genuine philosophical curiosity, the way his voice, the voice that had fought through a childhood stammer and 2 decades of enforced silence, commanded every single frame it occupied, as though the camera had been invented specifically for this moment. Pulp Fiction won the Palme d'Or at Cannes. It changed cinema in ways that are still reverberating. And it changed everything for Samuel L. Jackson, in ways that could no longer be postponed or denied. He was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor. He did not win, a decision that sparked a controversy that continues echoing through Hollywood conversations to this day. Be widely and consistently regarded as one of the most significant oversights in the history of the ceremony. The industry, even in the act of celebrating him, found one final way to remind him of a ceiling that had no logical justification. But the audience needed no such reminder and required no such ceiling. Jules Winfield became immortal overnight. Theaters erupted at his scenes, with the particular energy of an audience recognizing something genuinely new. Quotes from his dialogue entered the permanent vocabulary of popular culture within weeks. And Samuel L. Jackson, the invisible boy from Chattanooga, who had been told by silence and rejection and addiction and 20 years of closed doors that he simply did not belong at this level, suddenly belonged everywhere, all at once, without apology. And the years that followed were a controlled and magnificent explosion. Die Hard with a Vengeance, A Time to Kill, Jackie Brown, The Negotiator, Unbreakable, role after relentless role, genre after genre, Samuel demolished every assumption about what a black actor in Hollywood was permitted to be. He played heroes and villains, fathers and philosophers, soldiers and monsters, and brought to every single one of them the specific gravity and absolute authority of a man who had earned his place through the hardest possible means and had no intention of pretending otherwise. He was not given a career, he excavated one, from the rubble of everything that had spent 20 years trying to bury him. There is a particular loneliness that lives at the top. Not the loneliness of obscurity, which Samuel L. Jackson knew with painful and exhaustive intimacy. That loneliness had a logic to it, a cause and effect that at least made sense, even when it was unbearable. This was a different and more disorienting species of isolation entirely. The loneliness of omnipresence, of being recognized everywhere and truly known almost nowhere, of having your face projected across the entire world, while the person behind it moves through his private hours in a silence that fame not only fails to fill, but somehow deepens. By the early 2000s, Samuel L. Jackson was not simply famous. He was ubiquitous, in a way that very few entertainers in history have managed to become. His face appeared on screens across every continent. His voice narrated documentaries, animated features, and the kind of cultural moments that people remember exactly where they were when they first encountered them. He had become a living shorthand for cool, for authority, for the particular combination of danger and intellectual presence that Hollywood had spent decades insisting could not be commercially viable in a black man's body. They had been wrong about that. He had proven it methodically, relentlessly, and at considerable personal cost. And yet the industry that celebrated his commercial dominance continued revealing its deepest contradictions with almost impressive consistency. The Oscar that Pulp Fiction should have delivered never materialized into the recognition his cumulative body of work demanded. Despite a filmography unmatched in its breadth, range, and sustained commercial power, Hollywood's highest formal recognition remained elusive, in ways that had nothing to do with talent and everything to do with the unspoken architecture of who the industry historically chose to honor, and who it chose to regard as spectacle rather than artistry. Samuel watched. He did not rage publicly. He had learned long ago that public rage was a luxury that cost more than it was worth. He was far more strategic than that. He kept working. In 2008, something shifted the axis of his career once more, in a direction no one could have fully anticipated. Samuel L. Jackson accepted the role of Nick Fury in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, appearing at the very end of Iron Man in a scene that lasted barely 2 minutes, and announced the beginning of something that would eventually become the most commercially successful franchise in the history of cinema. Over the following 15 years, He would appear in more Marvel Cinematic Universe productions than almost any other actor, becoming the connective tissue of an entertainment universe that reached audiences who had not yet been born when Pulp Fiction first detonated across the culture. The franchise brought entirely new generations to his name and his work, but it also brought a new category of pressure that had its own particular weight and its own particular cost. The schedule was relentless, in a way that even his most demanding earlier years had not fully prepared him for. Franchise contracts spanning years, filming commitments that colonized entire seasons of his life, our promotional obligations that circled the globe, with the exhausting repetition of an obligation that never fully ends. For a man who had spent the first half of his career starving for exactly this kind of work and this kind of recognition, the abundance was everything he had fought for and imagined during the hungry years. But abundance, as Samuel was learning in ways he rarely discussed publicly, has its own specific and underestimated weight, and he was carrying considerably more of it than anyone watching the films from the comfortable darkness of a theater ever saw, or was intended to see. The losses had begun accumulating in the way they do for a man of a certain age, and a certain generation, and a certain history. Friends from the early New York theater years, but the men and women who had sat beside him through the longest and most invisible decades began disappearing one by one, some to illness, some to the particular devastation that found too many black men of his era in America. Lives shortened by a country that had never fully resolved its relationship with their right to exist fully and freely within it. Each loss was a subtraction not merely of a person, but of a witness, someone who had known him before the fame arrived and rewrote the official story of who he was and had always been. His health demanded increasing and careful attention that the public Samuel L. Jackson rarely allowed to surface visibly. Years of relentless production schedules and the particular physical demands of action filmmaking had accumulated into a body that required more deliberate management than the commanding screen presence suggested was necessary. The joints. The sustained energy required to maintain the pace he had set for himself since walking out of rehabilitation in 1991, with the resolve of a man who felt he had no margin for further slowness. And yet, through all of it, the marriage held. LaTanya Richardson Jackson, the woman who had stood in a kitchen in 1991 and made the most difficult and most loving decision of her life, was still there. Their relationship had never been the frictionless, photogenic partnership that Hollywood prefers for its legends. It was something considerably more honest and more enduring than that. A union rebuilt from the specific rubble of addiction and the long, unglamorous, daily work of choosing each other again, after the reasons to leave had been entirely real and entirely justified. Samuel has spoken about LaTanya in interviews with a quality of reverence that strips away every layer of performance and leaves something genuinely unguarded. "She saved my life," he has said, not as a figure of speech, not for the benefit of a journalist with a recorder running. She saved my life, and I have spent every day since trying to understand what it means to be worth that. Their daughter Zoe grew into a woman who carried both the weight of her father's absence during the addiction years and the complicated, hard-earned pride of watching him rebuild himself into someone she could genuinely know. The reconciliation between them, quiet and entirely private, became one of the truest and most meaningful measures of who Samuel L. Jackson had actually become. Not the cumulative box office, not the franchise presence, not the honorary Oscar arriving decades after the fact. The fact that his daughter chose, with full knowledge of the history, to know him. By his late 60s and into his 70s, Samuel L. Jackson occupied a position in Hollywood and in the broader culture that the industry had no existing template for and no honest framework to contain. Too iconic to be overlooked, too fiercely independent to be managed or softened into something more comfortable, too experienced to be moved by pressure that would have destroyed him 40 years earlier. He had paid every price the throne demanded. The 2 decades of invisibility, the decade of addiction, and the losses that fame could not prevent, and money could never adequately replace. The formal recognition withheld for reasons that had nothing to do with the quality of his work, and everything to do with the discomfort of an industry still learning how to genuinely reckon with the people it had benefited from while keeping at arm's length. He had paid all of it, and he was still standing. In 2024, Samuel L. Jackson received the Academy Honorary Award, not a competitive Oscar won in the heat of a single awards season, an honorary one, the kind the Academy bestows when the accumulated weight of an omission finally becomes too heavy to carry in continued silence. The audience rose, the room filled with the particular warmth of a long overdue and somewhat complicated reckoning. And Samuel, 75 years old, stood at that microphone with the complete composure of a man who had spent 5 decades learning, at considerable cost, exactly how to hold a room. He did not cry. He did not rage. He smiled the unhurried smile of someone who already knew the ending and had made his peace with the journey it required. Because Samuel L. Jackson had stopped needing Hollywood's permission a long time ago. The external validation he once chased across 2 decades of empty callbacks and closed doors had been replaced by something the industry could neither grant nor revoke on any timeline it chose. A legacy so vast, so thoroughly woven into the fabric of global culture, that no single trophy could contain it, and no single historic oversight could diminish it in any way that ultimately mattered. Today, he moves through the world with the deliberate, unhurried pace of a man who understands the value of time in a way that only those who nearly lost it permanently can fully appreciate. His activism remains vocal, specific, and uncompromising. He uses his platform not as decoration or as the performance of conscience, but as an actual instrument, speaking on racial justice, voting rights, and the specific responsibility that comes with visibility and influence, with the same directness that once made studio executives deeply uncomfortable, and audiences feel seen and electrified in the same moment. At home, the man who once lay unconscious on a kitchen floor wakes each morning beside the woman who chose to save him. LaTanya, still present, still the most honest and enduring measure of everything he fought to become. His daughter Zoe knows her father, really and fully knows him, not the icon the world constructed around his performances, the man who failed and stayed and came back and chose differently. That, more than any box office record, more than any franchise stretched across 15 years and 30 films, more than any award delivered a generation late. Is the actual architecture of a life rebuilt with intention and sustained by love that proved itself under conditions that would have extinguished it in a lesser partnership. Samuel L. Jackson did not become legendary in spite of his suffering. He became legendary because of what he refused, with a stubbornness that bordered on the sacred, to allow that suffering to permanently take from him the voice, the hunger, the unbreakable, almost irrational insistence on being seen and heard in a world that spent the better part of 20 years practicing the specific art of looking away from exactly what he had to offer. He arrived late to the spotlight, but he arrived entirely as himself, fully formed, fully earned. carrying every scar openly and without apology. See, and that is the only version of arrival that ever truly lasts long enough to mean something. If this story moved you, leave a like for a man who proved that the greatest comeback is not from failure, but from the kind of silence that tries to convince you year after year that you were never meant to speak at all. Subscribe. Stay with us, because the next legend is already waiting.